Hey there. Tonight, we are following a very old whisper across the Pacific. And recently, researchers used advanced AI models to compare flood myths, seafloor maps, old speculative texts, Polynesian traditions, and 19th century archaeological claims. And what surfaced was not a neat proof of a lost continent, but a haunting pattern, a memory of drowned homelands stitched together so tightly that it began to look like one vanished mother world called Mu. If quiet mysteries like this are your kind of night listening, please like the video and subscribe. Now let the lights soften a little. Let your breathing become slower and easier. Let the room settle around you. We are going out over black water now, and the story begins where maps become imagination. The Pacific at night does not behave like an ordinary place. It looks too large to belong to one world. The water stretches so far into darkness that the horizon feels less like a line and more like a thought your eyes cannot finish. Even the stars seem uncertain above it, scattered across the sky and reflected again below, as if the ocean were trying to borrow heaven for a few hours. The source begins here for a reason. Mu can only enter the mind properly if the mind first accepts scale. Not a bay, not a chain of reefs, not a pretty island remembered fondly by sailors with too much rum and too much moonlight. A missing world, a cradle, a motherland, something so large that, if it had ever existed, it would force history to start again from a different shore. That is the seduction of Mu. Not only that it was lost, but that if it was real, then everything we were taught about origins might be only the afterglow of something older. I have always thought that people do not fall in love with lost continents because they are foolish. They fall in love with them because ordinary history can feel strangely incomplete. We are told that civilization rises in river valleys, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River. We picture irrigation, grain, walls, temples, ledgers, kings. All of that is real. All of it matters. And yet there is another part of the human mind that keeps glancing seaward and wondering whether some first chapter has slipped off the page. The source leans into that wonder almost immediately. It does not say Mu is proved. It does something more effective than that. It gathers whispers. It shows how stories of drowned homelands keep appearing in places too distant from one another to feel comfortable, and then it lets that discomfort do its work. In Polynesian traditions, there are chants and remembered homelands beyond the horizon, lands that trembled, broke, or were consumed. In southern India, the old dream of Kumari Kandam rises from literary memory, a southern land lost to the sea. In Greece, Plato gave the Western imagination Atlantis, a proud civilization brought down in catastrophe. In Mesopotamia, flood stories preserve the memory of a world erased by water and survived only through chosen remnants. In indigenous traditions from coasts later confirmed by geological change, the shoreline is remembered as it once was, farther out, more generous, now gone. The source keeps turning these examples in the light. Different places, different names, different cosmologies, but the same emotional shape. A world before, a flood, a break, survivors, a smaller after. Recently, the AI angle built into this version of the story makes that pattern even stranger. Researchers fed collections of flood myths, translation layers, coastal oral traditions, and archaeological summaries into modern clustering systems to see whether the recurring motifs were superficial or structurally deep. The model compared sequences rather than just keywords. Loss of land, divine anger or natural upheaval, survivors preserving knowledge, islands or mountains remaining as fragments, a journey outward. The result was not proof of Mu, and it is important to say that plainly. But the result did show that these stories resemble one another in deeper narrative architecture more often than chance alone would make emotionally comfortable. That is where the room starts to feel colder. Because Mu, in the source, is not introduced as one more fairy tale. It is introduced as a ghost assembled from correlations. Not one literary source, not one canonical scripture, not one clean tradition. A continent built from fragments, speculative archaeology, occult enthusiasm, flood memory, and the stubborn human refusal to believe that all beginnings were small. And then comes the black water again. The source returns us there beautifully. The Pacific at night. Waves rolling in patient repetition. Wind moving across a surface that reveals nothing. Somewhere under all that depth, if you allow the imagination one careful step too far, there could be roads, quarries, foundations, terraces, temples, or nothing at all but basalt, trenches, volcanic ridges, and a silence broad enough to shelter any dream. That tension matters. The story lives there. Some argue that modern sonar has mapped only part of the ocean floor in fine detail, and that large regions remain poorly explored. That is true in the broad sense. Oceanography still leaves much unseen. Some point to submerged plateaus and seamount chains and feel their pulse quicken. Onong Java, Shatsky Rise, volcanic immensities with names that sound half geological and half mythic even before one learns what they are. Mainstream geologists, of course, interpret them as volcanic features formed through known tectonic processes, not as a lost continental foundation. The source is fair about that. It never asks the listener to ignore science. It asks the listener to stay inside the discomfort between what science rules out and what memory still seems to want. You know that feeling when a place becomes more mysterious, not because you know less, but because you know just enough to understand how much of the world can disappear and still leave emotional residue. That is the Pacific here. The source then asks a more dangerous question. What does it mean to call a place the cradle of civilization? It is not a small phrase. A cradle is more than an origin point. It is something nurturing, unifying, maternal, older than the children who leave it. If Mu were truly such a place, then Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, Mesoamerica, Polynesia, perhaps even farther worlds of stone and symbol, would all become descendants rather than beginnings. That is why the idea refuses to die. It offers coherence. It gathers isolated wonders and tells them they are siblings. Later writers, especially James Churchward, would turn that coherence into an empire of imagination. But before we get to him, the source lets the listener linger in the first problem. Where are the ruins? If Mu was so vast, why is the sea floor not littered with its bones? Where are the drowned avenues, the stepped towers, the cut stones, the inscriptions, the harbor walls, the human waste that every real civilization leaves behind in embarrassing abundance? That absence is the legend's deepest wound. Some believers answer with catastrophe, volcanic fire, earthquakes, tidal waves, sediment, time, a destruction so total that even cities became dust before the water finished its work. Others answer with incomplete exploration. We have not looked deeply enough, or not in the right places, or not with the right interpretive frame. Skeptics answer more bluntly. There are no ruins because there was no continent. The source does not choose this early. It lets all three moods sit together in the room: grief, hope, and suspicion. And then it does something clever. It shifts from geology to cultural memory. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically. That is not myth. That is measured. Glaciers melted. Coasts drowned. Plains vanished. Science has confirmed real drowned lands in other parts of the world. Doggerland once linked Britain to mainland Europe. Sunderland once stretched across much of what is now maritime Southeast Asia. Ancient river systems survive beneath the sea as pale channels visible through sonar and sediment mapping. The AI researchers in this version of the tale fed those real geological records into climate simulation models and compared them with the temporal clustering of flood traditions from multiple regions. Again, the result was not a lost Pacific supercontinent magically reappearing on a screen. It was something subtler. Human memory appears to hold on to catastrophe for astonishing lengths of time when that catastrophe reshapes coastlines, identity, and migration. That detail matters so much that I want to linger over it. Imagine a shoreline you have known since childhood. The tide comes and goes. Birds work the shallows. Canoes return at dusk. Your people know where the freshwater rises, where the fish run, where the safe shallows end. Then the water begins to change. Not in one theatrical movie wave, but season by season, year by year, storm by storm. Low places vanish. Marsh becomes inlet. Inlet becomes sea. Graves are swallowed. The old crossing disappears. The place where your grandparents stood to point toward the horizon is underwater now. A generation later, children grow up hearing of the lost shore as if it were half memory and half sacred warning. Now multiply that by thousands of communities across millennia. The source suggests that once you do that, Mu starts looking less like one simple falsehood and more like a single great vessel carrying many real losses. That idea comes later in full. But the first movement already prepares it. The ocean becomes both grave and archive. Myth becomes not the opposite of history, but a way of preserving emotional truth after physical context is gone. Still, the legend needs its modern prophets. The source then starts walking toward the 19th century, toward men who looked at ruins and refused to believe local development could explain them. Adventure archaeology was in full bloom then, half scholarship, half obsession. 1 foot in notebooks, 1 foot in fever dreams. Dense jungles hid Maya cities. Egypt still felt inexhaustible. Scripts were undeciphered or barely understood. The modern world had enough science to feel bold, and not enough yet to feel embarrassed. It was the perfect age for Mu to climb back onto the stage. And its first real modern voice would come not from the Pacific, but from the humid green half-darkness of Yucatan, where ruined cities rose through vines. And one man became convinced that the stones were whispering of something much older than the Maya themselves. That is where the next step in the story waits. In the jungle, under glass plates, serpent carvings, and the fervent certainty of a man who saw a drowned motherland hidden behind the glyphs. By the time we leave the open Pacific and step into the jungles of Yucatan, the atmosphere changes completely. Salt and horizon give way to green heat, wet stone, insect sound, and the peculiar silence that hangs over abandoned ceremonial spaces. The source moves here because Mu needed, in the modern imagination, something more than distant waves and scattered flood memories. It needed stone. It needed ruins. It needed a believer stubborn enough to look at one civilization and insist he was seeing the afterimage of another. That believer was Augustus Le Plongeon. He arrived in the late 19th century. During that strange era when archaeology still had the manners of an expedition and the ego of a seance. He was not a conventional scholar. The source describes him correctly as an eccentric blend of photographer, explorer, linguist, and visionary, which is a polite way of saying he was exactly the sort of man who could be wrong in fascinating ways. Where others saw Maya ruins emerging from jungle cover, he saw a coded testimony to a civilization older than Egypt, older than Mesopotamia, older than any accepted cradle. A civilization he believed had once stood at the beginning of everything. If you were standing with him among the ruins, you might understand why the temptation was so strong. The Yucatan cities do not reveal themselves all at once. They rise in stages. A stair edge under roots. A cut block under moss. A terrace line where the forest does not grow quite naturally. Then, suddenly, geometry. A pyramid face. A platform. A serpent head carved in stone. A courtyard broad enough to hold ceremony, politics, astronomy, and fear in the same place. The jungle does not erase these cities cleanly. It half buries them, which is somehow more haunting. The ruins look as though they are in the act of returning from another age. Le Plongeon photographed them in that condition. His glass plate images, among the earliest visual documents of some of these sites, captured the mood perfectly. Temples half swallowed by vines, stairways darkened by growth and rain, stelae standing in humid light like exhausted witnesses. The source lingers on this, and it should, because his theory did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged from an encounter with grandeur. I have always thought that many bad theories begin as sincere responses to beauty. A person sees something magnificent, something they do not yet know how to place, and rather than let the mystery remain local and specific, they widen it until it touches the whole world. That is what Le Plongeon did. He believed the Maya inscriptions and monuments were not merely records of local kings, rituals, vars, and lineages, as later decipherment would largely show. He believed they were windows into a far older past. In his translations, now rejected by mainstream scholarship, he found references to catastrophe, migration, and a drowned homeland. That homeland he linked to Mu. The source treats this with the right balance. It does not mock him, but it does not trust him either. His readings were made before the true phonetic decipherment of Maya writing. He was working in a period of speculation, fragments, and projection. Yet what he projected would matter enormously. Because once he looked at Yucatan and saw not a regional civilization, but a surviving branch of a lost motherland. Mu gained its first modern archaeological theater. And Le Plongeon did not stop there. He noticed, or thought he noticed, recurring motifs that seemed to leap across oceans. Serpent, solar symbols, feathered divinities, sacred architecture rising in stepped forms. He looked at the serpent power of Quetzalcoatl and felt an echo of Egyptian sacred imagery. He looked at Maya and Egyptian symbolism and insisted such parallels could not have emerged independently. There had to be a shared origin. There had to be an older source from which both had inherited fragments. In his imagination, that source was Mu. No. Mainstream archaeology has long had a more grounded answer. Human beings, separated by oceans, still watch the same sky, fear the same storms, revere the same sun, notice the same snake, build upward with the same stone, and ritualize power with the same theatrical instinct. Similar symbols do not require one drowned parent civilization. They can arise because human minds, meeting similar pressures, sometimes make similar shapes. The source is fair about this, but it also understands why Le Plongeon felt unconvinced. The parallels can be emotionally persuasive even when they are methodologically weak. You know that feeling when coincidence begins to look almost rude, as if the world is repeating itself too neatly for comfort. That is where these cross-cultural similarities begin exerting force. Le Plongeon then moved into his most dramatic claim. Queen Mu and Prince Ko, legendary figures, in his reading, who became the bridge between Yucatan and Egypt. According to his interpretation, Queen Mu fled west to east after catastrophe and became remembered in Egypt as Isis, while Prince Ko became an Osiris figure. It is one of those intellectual leaps so large that it almost creates its own weather system. Yet the source is right to preserve it, because this is the moment Mu stops being vague, drowned rumor and starts becoming a proposed engine of world civilization. I admit, there is something almost lovable about the audacity of it. Entire civilizations linked through one exiled queen, one murdered prince, one drowned homeland. It is wild, yes, but it also reveals the deep desire underneath the theory. Not merely to find a lost land, but to heal the separateness of civilizations by giving them one ancestor. That longing matters. It will return again and again through Churchward and beyond, The source also notes something important about Le Plongeon's historical position. He was writing against a scholarly atmosphere that often assumed the Americas were younger, derivative, or less central than the old civilizations of the Mediterranean and Near East. By making Yucatan the keeper of an origin older than Egypt, he inverted the prestige map of the ancient world. Even though his conclusions were flawed, his instinct to question civilizational hierarchy had a strange, rebellious energy. It is one of the reasons his work lingered in imagination after scholars abandoned it. He was not merely inventing. He was redistributing dignity. Still, the code of Maya writing was eventually cracked by later scholarship, and when that happened, the Grand Mu Bridge did not appear. The glyphs spoke more clearly of dynasties, warfare, ceremonies, births, enthronements, cosmic order localized within Maya civilization itself. Le Plongeon's translations crumbled under that light, but myths do not always die when facts improve. Sometimes they become more resilient because now they can survive as atmosphere instead of argument. That is what happened with Mu. Le Plongeon gave it a setting. He gave it stone. He gave it serpents, queens, ruins, jungle air, and the emotional credibility of a man standing among undeniable greatness and saying, "This is not the beginning. This is the remainder." The source understands that phrase without having to say it directly. Mu lives in afterglow. It thrives wherever a known civilization looks too sophisticated, too symbolically rich, too astronomically alert, too monumental, too interconnected, and someone decides it must have inherited more than it invented. And then the legend found its greatest system builder. James Churchward did not merely inherit Le Plongeon's spark. He turned it into a cosmology. The source brings him in through colonial India, and the transition is perfect. Because the mood changes from jungle revelation to hidden archive. Not carved stelae in humid plazas now, but secret tablets in a sanctuary, rare instruction from a priest, and the irresistible claim that someone had finally touched the original record of the motherland itself. Before we go there, let the Yucatan remain for one more moment. The vines hanging across old walls, the heavy warm air pressing on carved stone, bird cries in the distance, the photographer adjusting his equipment while sweat gathers at the neck, a serpent head looking out from temple shadow, a man convinced that beneath local history lies a far older root system connecting Maya pyramids to Egypt, India, and the memory of a drowned beginning. He is wrong in the scholarly sense, yes, but he is productive in the mythic sense. He teaches the modern imagination how to see Mu. Recently, in keeping with the AI research angle of this version, digital humanities teams have used pattern recognition systems to compare the visual structures of Maya motifs, Egyptian solar symbols, and broader ancient iconographic families. The result, unsurprisingly to specialists, does not support Le Plongeon's direct civilizational lineage. The parallels are too broad and too explainable through independent cultural formation. But that same analysis showed something psychologically revealing. Human observers consistently overdetect deep connection when confronted with monumental architecture, recurring sacred animals, and solar imagery. In other words, the mind itself is primed to create Mu-like theories when faced with cross-cultural grandeur. I find that deeply interesting. It means Mu may be not only a legend of the past, but a reflex of the human pattern seeking instinct, especially when ruins are beautiful enough to feel older than their own dates. And yet, the story becomes stranger, not weaker, when Churchward enters, because he no longer claims to intuit Mu from ruins. He claims to have read its archive, a set of delicate ancient tablets, a hidden script older than Sanskrit, older than hieroglyphs, older even than the first wedge marks of Mesopotamia. A script that told not of one regional people, but of the first history of humanity itself. That is where the next chamber of the legend opens. In India, under priestly trust, among symbols no museum ever received and no scholar ever verified, which, perversely, is one reason they became so powerful. A visible artifact can be tested, dated, and reduced. A missing artifact can become anything. The strangest thing about missing evidence is how much room it gives a story to breathe. Once James Churchward enters the legend of Mu, the atmosphere changes at once. Augustus le Plongeon Hadrins, humid stone, serpent carvings, and the overgrown dignity of Maya cities to work with. Churchward had something far more volatile. A hidden archive, a vanished script, a priest who supposedly opened a locked door for one patient outsider, and behind that door, a record of the first civilization on Earth. It is the sort of claim that either collapses in sunlight or lives forever in twilight. And Mu, as the source presents it, has always preferred twilight. Churchward said the story began in India, not in a museum, not in a university archive, not in a place where many eyes could examine the same thing and argue productively for years over signs, dates, clay, and context. It began in priestly secrecy. He claimed that during his years in India, he gained the trust of a high temple priest who eventually allowed him to study sacred tablets of a lost order called the Na-Kal. These tablets, he said, preserved the real history of Mu. No, right away, the source does the responsible thing. It tells us the central problem. No verified photographs of these tablets were produced. No broadly accepted transcription exists. No museum catalog holds them. No independent scholar confirmed their existence in the form Churchward described. That missing material is the wound that never closes. And yet, oddly enough, it is also the reason the legend stays alive. A thing behind glass can be tested. A thing that vanished back into secrecy can keep changing shape inside the mind. I have always found that almost unfairly effective. When evidence is absent, imagination stops having to behave. Churchward described the Na-Kal script as a kind of root language of symbols, simple but profound, containing a record not just of one people, but of humanity's earliest civilizational home. In his account, Mu was not a minor island realm, not a poetic ruin, not even a respectable lost kingdom of the kind Plato might have enjoyed. It was a true mother continent, stretching across the Pacific in immensity, sheltering a population of 64 million people, unified in religion, governance, and knowledge while other lands still waited in darkness. The source lets that scale settle slowly, and that is wise, because the claim is almost too large to absorb all at once. 64 million. In the ancient world, that number feels less like demography and more like weather. A continent dense with cities, ports, fields, temples, roads, and schools. A single cultural matrix older than Egypt, older than Sumer, older than the civilizations that standard history places at the beginning. Mu in Churchward's telling was not one more branch on the tree. It was the trunk. Recently, in the AI reframing of this story, researchers took Churchward's written descriptions, his maps, his symbolic tableau, and the recurring elements from later Mu literature, then compared them using machine patterning tools against known ancient civilizational profiles, urban density estimates, agricultural carrying capacity, monument distribution, maritime distance, calendar systems, religious unification models. The result was fascinating, though not in the way believers might hope. The AI did not validate Mu as a historical continent, but it did show that Churchward consistently described Mu as a composite, ideal civilization, one that blended characteristics of Egypt, India, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and Polynesia into a single ancestral model. In other words, he was not just remembering a lost place. He was constructing a civilizational parent from the pieces of all the great children. That makes the legend more revealing, not less. Because Churchward's Mu is not random fantasy. It is highly organized longing. In his account, the people of Mu, the Naakal, were spiritually refined, technically sophisticated, and socially unified. They understood astronomy with precision. They mastered navigation across enormous distances. They organized agriculture on a vast scale. They built in stone. They encoded sacred truths in symbols, not because they were primitive, but because symbol was, in this telling, a more elegant vessel for wisdom than ordinary language. There is something deeply 19th century in that combination. Imperial confidence, occult reverence, and the dream of a lost universal wisdom that might reconcile science, religion, empire, and myth in one grand hidden past. The source is careful not to sneer at that. It simply places it in its proper temperature, warm enough to enchant, cool enough to inspect. If you imagine Churchward at his desk, papers spread before him, maps open, annotations creeping into margins, old books leaning against one another like co-conspirators, you can almost feel the pleasure of the system clicking into place. Symbols from India, stone enigmas from Mexico, flood memories from the Pacific, serpent cults, sun worship, giant monuments, strange correspondences. The lost continent becomes a magnet that pulls them into one elegant arrangement. The world stops looking disconnected. History starts behaving like a family secret. You know that feeling when a theory becomes irresistible, not because every part is proven, but because it makes too many scattered things feel suddenly related. That is the real force of Mu in this stage. Churchward also gave the Naakal a missionary role. They were not simply the inhabitants of Mu. They were the dispersers of civilization. After catastrophes or through intentional expansion, they carried knowledge outward to India, Egypt, the Americas, and the islands of the Pacific. This matters because it solves, at least narratively, the same problem Le Plongeon wrestled with. Why do monumental cultures on opposite sides of the world sometimes feel like distant cousins in symbolism, architecture, and sacred geometry? Churchward's answer is simple. They are cousins. Mu is the ancestor. Mainstream archaeology, of course, offers a harder and less romantic answer. Human beings share similar bodies, similar perceptions, similar skywatching habits, similar engineering constraints, and similar social needs. They build pyramidal forms because stone and gravity reward broad bases and narrowing mass. They worship the sun because the sun is impossible to ignore. They ritualize serpents because serpents are both feared and symbolically rich in agricultural environments. None of this requires a lost Pacific motherland. The source makes that case clearly. But then it does something more interesting. It asks why the motherland idea continues to feel emotionally persuasive even when specific claims do not survive scrutiny. Part of the answer lies in Churchward's missing tablets. The source returns to them again and again, because that is the weak hinge on which the whole grand door turns. The Nakal tablets are both the foundation and the ghost of the story. Had they been produced, photographed, translated under hostile review, and entered into scholarship, Mu would either have gained a real evidentiary life or died quickly. Instead, they remain absent, and absence is strangely nutritious for myth. It lets every generation imagine that the proof almost existed, was once touched, was glimpsed, and then receded again into priestly darkness. There is also the matter of script itself. Churchward described signs, arrangement, and meanings that suggested a primordial wisdom system. In the AI-based reinterpretation, scholars and analysts have compared his reported symbols with known Brahmi, Indus, Proto-Elamite, Egyptian, Maya, and invented esoteric scripts. The overlap patterns are thin and inconsistent. Some signs resemble common geometric motifs found in many cultures. Some look suspiciously like the sort of universal shapes humans keep making whenever they want to feel ancient. Spirals, crosses, radiant circles, layered bars, curves that could be anything from waves to serpents to decorative instinct. That matters, because it suggests that even if Churchward believed he was decoding a deep ancestral system, he may have been responding to the archetypal power of simple forms rather than to a verifiable ancient language. And yet, somehow, the room does not lose all its mystery, because the source never needed Churchward to be right in a narrow sense. It needed him to expand Mu from a rumor into a world. He did that completely. He furnished it with people, order, religion, symbols, migration route, memory, and doom. After him, Mu was no longer an interesting maybe. It was a continent with a biography. The source lingers for a while inside that biography, and that is where the legend becomes almost soothing in its scale. Imagine Mu before its fall. Broad fertile plains under a warm Pacific sky. Great ceremonial cities with avenues aligned to the heavens. Harbors full of carved vessels. Agricultural systems disciplined and abundant. Priest scholars watching stars with methods later civilizations would inherit only in broken pieces. A language of symbols carrying theology, astronomy, and memory all together. The Nakal walking among temples and observatories with the serene confidence of a people who believe they stand at the beginning of history. Perhaps worse, believe they always will. Honestly, there is something almost tender in the way lost civilizations are imagined at their height. They are rarely just powerful. They are balanced, wise, harmonious, more unified than we are, more spiritually integrated, more elegant in the use of nature. The source understands that Mu functions partly as criticism of the present. It is a mirror held up to industrial modernity by saying, once, perhaps, there was a civilization vast and subtle enough to know what we have forgotten. That may be why the missing evidence never quite kills it. Mu is not only a place, it is a rebuke. Still, the legend cannot stay in library warmth forever. Once Churchward gives Mu language and people, the next thing he must give it is land. And once it has land, it must also face the terrible question that comes for all drowned worlds. How large was it? Where exactly did it lie? And how, in one of the boldest claims ever made about a lost civilization, did it vanish in a single, overwhelming catastrophe? That is where the source goes next. From hidden tablets to maps. From maps to continental scale. From continental scale to annihilation. And once those maps are spread across the table, the Pacific no longer looks empty at all. It looks haunted by shape. Once Mu had tablets, priests, and a people, it needed a body. That is always the next demand in stories like this. A legend can survive for a while on fragments, correspondences, and atmosphere, but eventually someone must draw a map. The moment a map appears, the dream becomes more dangerous and more persuasive at the same time. Dangerous because maps pretend to be exact. Persuasive because the eye is easily seduced by shape. The source understands that perfectly. It lets Churchward spread Mu across the Pacific in such sweeping confidence that, for a few moments, even skepticism has to pause and look. Churchward's Mu was not a cluster of islands. It was not a drowned shelf near some continental edge. It was an enormous landmass, sometimes described in ways that made it larger than many modern continents, stretching across the Pacific and connecting what are now remote island chains into the mountain ridges and highlands of one vast lost terrain. In this model, islands like Easter Island, Hawaii, Tahiti, the Marshalls, and others were not isolated dots. They were the surviving peaks of a much larger world whose lower plains had gone under. There is something almost narcotic about that image. You look at a Pacific map long enough, and the emptiness begins to demand invention. Churchward supplied it with perfect confidence. Here were once roads, cities, ports, observatories, temple complexes, agricultural basins, sacred mountains. and long inhabited coastal belts now obliterated by the sea. The source does not rush this part. It lets the map unfold slowly, because in the history of Mu belief, the map is not just a detail. It is the decisive, emotional threshold. The moment Mu stops being abstract and becomes visible enough to mourn. If you were standing over such a map in the lamplight of an old study, fingers resting on the edge of the Pacific Basin, you could almost feel the pleasure of the explanation. Why so many island cultures share oceanic skill? Why certain symbols recur? Why great stone works stand in remote places? Why flood memory clings to so many traditions around the sea? Because all these fragments were once neighbors. Because the empty ocean was not empty. Because what now appears broken was once whole. I have always thought that wholeness is the true narcotic in lost continent theories. They offer repair. They take scattered mysteries and place them back into one body. The source then lets Churchward describe Mu at its height. Broad plains warm under tropical light. Rivers moving through fertile basins. Great ceremonial centers aligned to stars and solstices. Agricultural abundance supporting tens of millions. A religion centered on sun, source, and cosmic order. Knowledge distributed through sacred institutions, not yet broken into the rival priesthoods and fragmentary inheritances of later civilizations. The Pacific, in this vision, ceases to be a distance between worlds and becomes the center of the first world. The AI reframing of this material makes the pattern even clearer. Researchers compared Churchward's descriptions against known, idealized civilizational templates found in utopian myth, theosophical literature, esoteric alternative history, and 19th century diffusionist theories. The alignment is striking. Mu is repeatedly described with a bundle of traits that humans tend to assign to imagined parent civilizations. Centralized wisdom, massive population, spiritual purity, monumental skill, maritime mastery, a disaster that scatters survivors who seed later cultures. The model output suggested that Mu functions in narrative terms almost exactly like a lost source code for civilization. That does not make it false in every sense. It makes it deeply revealing about the kind of origin story modern people hunger for. And then comes the death of the continent. The source handles this with delicious dread, because Churchward did not imagine Mu slipping gently beneath rising seas over thousands of years. He imagined a convulsion, a final night, volcanic fire, tectonic rupture, earthquake so violent the crust itself failed beneath the continent, great fissures opening, flames rising, the sea rushing inward, whole cities destroyed in one immense collapse. The kind of apocalypse that leaves no time for adaptation, only for a few far-flung survivors already elsewhere to carry memory into a smaller world. The image clearly draws strength from real disasters. Krakatoa echoes here. So does Santorini. So do earthquakes, tsunamis, and the known violence of the Pacific Ring of Fire. The source is good on this point. Churchward was writing in a world already made aware by newspapers and scientific reports that islands could explode, coasts could drown, and civilizations near the sea were always more fragile than they seemed. Mu took those real possibilities and scaled them upward until the whole Pacific became an apocalyptic stage. Imagine it, the way the source encourages you to, slowly, without graphic noise, with the softness that often makes catastrophe feel larger. A warm, coastal evening, dense population, firelight in the cities, priests at the top of step sanctuaries, boats at anchor in protected harbors. Then first a trembling underfoot, too low to name. Birds lifting from groves in strange numbers. Water drawing back in some places and rising in others. Temple braziers tipping. Stone groaning. A horizon beginning to burn where no sunrise should be. Then the long roar. There is a particular terror in imagined continental death because it destroys scale itself. An island can be evacuated, mourned, remembered. A continent should not be able to die in a night. That is what gives the Mu catastrophe its unnatural power. It takes the stable thing, land, and treats it like weather. And yet this is where geology enters the room like cold air through an open door. The source does not let the catastrophe stand unchallenged. Modern plate tectonics leaves very little room for a literal Mu in Churchward's sense. Continents are not theatrical props. They do not simply sink whole into the ocean basin overnight. Continental crust. It rides higher. It leaves signatures. The Pacific floor, as mapped and studied, is overwhelmingly oceanic crust, volcanic plateaus, trenches, ridges, and seamount chains, not the drowned remains of a missing continent the size Churchward wanted. This is one of the places where the AI layer becomes especially useful. Researchers fed bathymetric maps, crustal density data, plate motion models, and known paleogeographic reconstructions into geological simulation systems. The result was blunt. There is no plausible tectonic pathway for a continent-sized Mu to have existed in the Pacific during the time frame implied by Churchward and then vanished in a catastrophic single event without leaving the sort of continental evidence geologists would unmistakably recognize. The models do allow for drowned islands, volcanic collapse, changing coastlines, and local land losses. They do not allow the grand Churchward version. That is the hardest blow the legend takes, and the source does not soften it too much. It should not. A sleep story can be gentle without being dishonest. The literal sinking continent is the most scientifically fragile part of Mu. Still, something curious happens after that blow. The legend does not vanish. It changes temperature. Once the strict geological impossibility of a Pacific supercontinent is admitted, the emotional force of Mu begins relocating from physical landmass to submerged memory. The source starts preparing that turn here, even before it states it openly later. Maybe Mu was never one continent in the tectonic sense. Maybe it was many real losses fused by human storytelling into one immense remembered homeland. Maybe Churchward mistook mosaic memory for geography. That thought becomes easier to hold if you return to the end of the Ice Age. Real sea level rise. Real drowning of shelves. River valleys, coasts, and low islands. Real human communities displaced. Real oral memory transmitted through generations. The Pacific, especially, is full of volcanic landscapes, unstable shores, and migration histories so vast that no tidy schoolbook ever seems equal to them. Add to that the emotional fact that islands often experience the sea not as scenic boundary, but as total environment, road, god, threat, inheritance, and grave. And the possibility of drowned memory starts to feel stronger than the fantasy of a sunken continent. Not weaker. You know that feeling when a story loses one spectacular feature and becomes more believable, and therefore, in some ways, sadder. That is what begins here. The source also uses the catastrophe of Mu to explain the dispersal of knowledge. Survivors flee outward. Some carry astronomy. Some carry architecture. Some carry sacred symbols. Some become teachers, culture bringers, civilizers, mysterious foreigners arriving by boat after the sea has taken everything. In Churchward's model, this is how Mu continues. Not through ruins underwater, but through descendants above it. That matters because it shifts the evidence away from seafloor archaeology and into human culture itself, where ambiguity thrives much more comfortably. The destruction scene, then, has a double purpose. It makes Mu emotionally unforgettable, and it explains the absence of Mu by making absence itself part of the story. I have always suspected that is why drowned civilizations endure so well in imagination. Their lack of evidence becomes a feature rather than a flaw. The sea is assigned the role of perfect thief. It takes the streets, the roofs, the inscriptions, the graves, and leaves only myths, symbols, and scattered peoples wondering where their oldest songs came from. By the end of this movement, the Pacific has changed again. At the start, it was empty black water inviting projection. Now it is layered with ghost geography. Sunken plains, volcanic scars, lost coasts, impossible maps, scientific refusal, mythic persistence. The source lets all of that coexist. It says, in effect, you are allowed to feel the beauty of the drowned map while also knowing the map, as drawn by Churchward, cannot stand. And once that contradiction settles, the story has to ask where Mu believers looked next for proof. Not in the ocean floor alone, but in the surviving stones of the world. Carved tablets in Mexico, giant heads on Easter Island, pyramids on multiple continents, serpents, spirals, sun disks, step forms, alignments. If the land itself could not testify plainly, perhaps the monuments could. That is where the next stage of the mystery waits. In stone, that seems, just for a moment, to remember more than it should. Now the story has reached the place where belief usually hardens, or softens, depending on what kind of mind is listening. Once, a lost continent cannot stand securely on the ocean floor. Its defenders turn toward the stones left above the water. Not the land itself now, but the marks that land may have made before it died. The source moves into this stage very naturally. If Mu cannot be lifted from the Pacific as a drowned continent, then perhaps it survives in fragments, in symbols, in monuments, in carved surfaces that seem to remember more than the societies around them should have known. This is where the room fills with stone. Not one kind of stone. Too many kinds. Volcanic tuff, limestone, basalt, granite, worked slabs and weathered faces, upright monoliths and fitted walls, quarries abandoned mid-gesture, statues staring past the sea, as if still waiting for a shoreline that moved away a very long time ago. The source understands that the human mind is vulnerable in the presence of old stone. A wall older than memory makes even disciplined people begin wondering whether history is too small. The first set of clues comes through objects believers have loved precisely because they are awkward. The Niven stones of Mexico are one such case. The source treats them with the right mixture of fascination and caution. They were reported in the early 20th century and described as carved stones bearing strange symbols. To those already enchanted by Mu, they looked like an archive dropped from some older and wider system, perhaps even a cousin of the missing Nacol tablets that Churchward never truly produced. That combination was irresistible. A missing archive in India, a mysterious symbolic corpus in Mexico. Put them together, and the mind immediately hears the word confirmation. But the source does not let the story become lazy there. The provenance of the Niven stones is disputed. Their context is poor. Their dating is unstable. The chain of custody is exactly the sort of thing that makes serious archaeologists grow quiet in the least encouraging way. Once context slips, fantasy rushes in. Still, even damaged evidence has atmosphere, and atmosphere has its own power. I can imagine the thrill of the first glance. Dust brushed away, incised markings emerging from the surface. A set of signs that look systematic enough to tempt, strange enough to resist, and disconnected enough from accepted scripts to feel like a door. That feeling matters because the source is not only telling a story about proof, it is telling a story about why the hunt for proof becomes so emotionally charged. And then the story crosses open water again, toward one of the most magnetic places in the whole mythology of Mu, Easter Island. Even speaking the name shifts the mood. A small triangle of land in an enormous ocean. Winds, grass, volcanic slopes, quarry scars. The sea always present, never quiet, never entirely friendly. And there, the moai. Those long faces, those severe brows, those compressed mouths, those bodies often deeper in the earth than casual visitors first understand. The source does exactly what it should do here. It lingers. It lets the listener stand in the dusk with the statues and feel the peculiar pressure they create. You know that feeling when a face does not need to move to seem watchful. The moai have that quality. They do not merely stand. They occupy. They make the surrounding air feel more ceremonial than it did a moment before. Believers in Mu have long treated them as orphans from a larger world, guardians placed on surviving high ground after a continental disaster, or the last visible children of a drowned civilization whose central lands are gone. The idea is easy to understand emotionally. Easter Island feels too isolated for such monumental effort, too severe, too deliberate, too visually complete in its mystery. Modern archaeology, of course, gives a more grounded account. The Rapa Nui carved the statues locally. The quarry remains at Rano Raraku. Transport methods, while still debated in finer details, are no longer magical problems. Some were dragged. Some may have been rocked upright in walking motions using rope systems. The society that made them was brilliant, adaptive, and local. The mystery is real. The lost continent is not required. The source gives that answer its due. But then it adds something more subtle. Even when explanation exists, emotional excess often remains. Knowing how a statue moved does not fully explain why a culture chose to fill a remote island with these solemn presences facing inland, or why the imagination keeps wanting them to belong to something larger than the island that made them. The AI layer in this retelling makes that sharper. Pattern recognition teams recently compared the proportional logic of the Moai, Mesoamerican monumentality, Old World colossi, and Pacific ritual architecture. The results supported what many archaeologists would expect. The Moai belong structurally to local Rapa Nui development, not to a direct architectural lineage from Egypt or Mesoamerica. Yet the same models also showed why casual observers consistently misread them as evidence of a common lost source. Human cognition strongly links giant worked faces, horizon-oriented ritual, and extreme labor investment with the intuition of civilizational inheritance. In plain language, the mind sees a monument too heavy for comfort and starts looking for an older teacher behind it. The source then widens the frame again, and this is where Mu becomes almost impossible to resist if one is not careful. Pyramids. In Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in parts of Asia, in altered forms in island cultures, in terraced ritual mountains, in stepped platforms. The same broad shape emerging across very distant civilizations. Narrower at the top, stable at the bottom, reaching upward while remaining difficult to topple. For believers, this is not engineering coincidence. It is memory in stone, a template carried outward from a parent civilization. For mainstream scholarship, it is convergence. Build high in stone, mud brick, or packed earth, and broad base tiered forms appear because gravity is not sentimental. Honestly, both responses feel emotionally understandable. A pyramid is practical. Yes. It is also symbolic, almost against its will. Upward motion. Sacred ascent. Visibility. Cosmic alignment. Any civilization that links power, sky, burial, and permanence will be tempted by that shape. The source wisely refuses to turn the pyramid into either trivial proof or trivial coincidence. It lets the tension remain. Similar forms can arise independently, and yet those forms still contribute to the emotional credibility of a lost origin story. Then the symbols arrive. Spirals, sun discs, serpents, crosses within circles, layered steps, radiant patterns. The source gathers them like shells from different shorelines and places them side by side. Not to say they are identical, because they are not. Not to say they prove Mu, because they do not. But to ask why certain images recur so powerfully in sacred art across the world. The serpent in particular matters. It appears in Mesoamerica, Egypt, India, the Pacific world. and beyond, sometimes as wisdom, sometimes as danger, sometimes as renewal, sometimes as sky power. To the believer, that recurrence feels ancestral. To the archaeologist, it feels human. Snakes are ancient companions to agriculture, fear, medicina, and transformation. Again, the same pattern. The meaningful and the explainable sitting in the same room. I think this is the point in the story where Mu becomes most seductive for intelligent people. Not because the evidence becomes stronger, because the ambiguity becomes richer. The source also hints at monumental knowledge embedded in placement itself. Statues aligned with coastlines, platforms oriented towards celestial events, sacred spaces structured through horizon watching and seasonal light. Once that enters the room, ordinary stone stops feeling ordinary. The builder no longer appears as a labor force alone, but as a mind measuring sky and land together. That matters because believers in Mu often treat astronomical order as one of the deepest fingerprints of a lost parent civilization. If many ancient cultures aligned architecture to solstices, equinox, stars, and rising points, perhaps they inherited one old sacred science. Yet here again the source keeps balance. Human beings everywhere see the sky. Farmers need the seasons. Priests need theater. Rulers need cosmic legitimacy. A temple that captures sunrise on one day of the year feels powerful because the sun really does arrive when promised. No continent of Mu is required for that. And still, when pattern after pattern accumulates, the heart sometimes reaches ahead of the evidence and imagines inheritance anyway. The most haunting detail may be that the source never lets any monument settle completely into explanation. Every site remains double, fully local, and strangely universal. Easter Island is Rapa Nui, and also the kind of place that makes lost continent believers lose sleep. Pyramids are products of local engineering and local theology, and also shapes that make the mind whisper ancestor. The Niven stones are dubious artifacts, and also exactly the kind of dubious artifacts a legend loves, because certainty never really improves mystery. By the end of this movement, the stones have not proved Mu. They have done something perhaps more enduring. They have given Mu a body made of fragments, a face on a lonely island, a symbol carved into uncertain stone, a stepped mountain in more than one civilization, a serpent coiling through distant sacred languages. The missing continent stays missing, but its imagined children stand above the water where everyone can argue over them forever. And once you allow those fragments to gather in the mind, the next question comes naturally. If Mu left traces and monuments, then what kind of people were said to have built it? What sort of civilization could stand behind so many later memories? That is where the source moves next, toward the Nakal themselves, the culture bringers, the teachers from the sea, and the dream that the greatest secret Mu left behind was not stone at all, but knowledge. Once the stones have done their work, the legend of Mu asks for people, not just anonymous builders, not just a vanished mass of labor and kingship, but a recognizable civilizational character, a style of mind, a race of teachers, or priests, or sage, or navigators, or all of those at once. The source turns here to the Nakal. And this is where Mu stops being only a place and becomes an inheritance system. It is no longer enough to say a continent drowned. The story now wants to explain how its memory continued to move through the world after its land was taken away. In Churchward's version, the Nakal were not a rough seafaring tribe clinging to volcanic coasts. They were the spiritual and intellectual aristocracy of the oldest world. Ordered, refined, technically capable, astronomically aware, morally elevated in that old romantic way lost civilizations almost always are. The source wisely presents this vision without pretending it is neutral. The Nakal are an idealized people, almost suspiciously idealized, more like the dream of ancestral competence than a population described through ordinary historical mess. No tax disputes, no dull kings, no petty border wars, just wisdom, harmony, and the sort of large-scale civilizational calm modern people project backward whenever they want the past to scold the present. I have always found that revealing. When people invent a lost mother civilization, they rarely make it mediocre. They make it all the things they suspect their own world has misplaced. The source then ties the Nakal to a larger family of figures found all over ancient tradition. Culture bringers, civilizing gods, teachers arriving from elsewhere, wise strangers from the sea, sky-linked ancestors, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Oannes in Mesopotamia rising from the waters to teach arts and order, Viracocha in Andean memory, Maui in the Pacific world, not identical in role, but part of the same imaginative landscape where primal knowledge belongs to liminal figures rather than to the ordinary crowd. Even the more speculative comparisons, Vedic teachers, enigmatic priest kings, wandering sages, receive a careful place in the source, not as proof of one literal Nakal diaspora, but as part of a broad narrative instinct. Civilizations often remember their highest knowledge as having arrived from elsewhere. That elsewhere is what Mu claims. If you were listening to an old tale beside surf and canoe wood, or in a temple court under a dry, hot sky, the arriving teacher would make immediate emotional sense. Knowledge feels external when it transforms life quickly. Agriculture, calendars, astronomy, writing, sacred law, navigación, monument building. These do not feel ordinary to people meeting them at scale for the first time. They feel bestowed. The source leans into that beautifully. Mu becomes plausible not through one perfect artifact, but through the recurring human habit of treating civilization as received. Recently, in the AI adaptation of this story, comparative narrative models were run across hundreds of myths involving culture bringers, law givers, sea arrivals, and pre-flood teachers. The systems were trained not only on keywords, but on event structure, relationship roles, and symbolic clustering. The outcome did not prove a single historical Nakal migration, of course, but it did reveal a powerful repeated form. Many traditions place their most transformative knowledge in the hands of beings who come from the edge of the world, from the sea, from heaven, or from an older age destroyed by catastrophe. That pattern is not Mu, but it is the exact narrative soil in which Mu grows best. And then the source turns toward what may be the most intoxicating part of the whole legend: lost science. Not science in lab coats and peer review, obviously. Something older. Sacred geometry, resonance, astronomical precision, aligned architecture, sound as force, stone moving not by magic exactly, but by knowledge later forgotten. This is the point where Mu stops being only a drowned homeland and becomes a lost operating system for civilization itself. It is also the point where a sleep story like this can become wonderfully eerie if handled gently. Picture a chamber cut from stone. Not large, not decorated in the loud way modern taste often prefers. Just proportioned with care. A single voice inside it hums, and the sound does not die. It lifts, folds, returns. The walls answer. The body feels the vibration not only in the ear, but in the ribs and teeth. There are real places in the ancient world where that kind of effect exists. Not proof of supernatural technology, just a reminder that old builders often understood space through the body as much as through the eye. The source uses this kind of detail carefully. Resonant chambers, precise alignments, massive stones fitted so tightly a blade scarcely enters between them, monuments pointing to equinox light or solstice dawn. The dream of Mu says such things are not isolated innovations. They are fragments of one original body of knowledge carried outward from a lost center. Mainstream archaeology says something more sober. Ancient peoples were intelligent, observant, patient, and fully capable of local engineering brilliance. Again, both thoughts remain in the room. The source never lets one entirely erase the emotional force of the other. I think this is where the story becomes most hypnotic. The idea that the ancient world knew not more facts than we do, but knew how to join facts, ritual, geometry, sound, agriculture, and sky into one seamless worldview. A worldview modern life has mostly broken into departments. That is why Mu feels spiritually advanced in the legend. Not because it had airplanes in the crude popular sense, or crystals doing whatever bad documentaries say crystals do. Because it symbolizes integration, temple and observatory, agriculture and astronomy, number and myth, stone and chant, practical life and sacred pattern. The lost science of Mu is the fantasy of a world where knowledge had not yet been cut into hostile pieces. The source also brushes close to the more speculative language of energy and force. It does this carefully enough to remain intelligent. Some believers imagine that builders from Mu understood earth currents, resonance fields, magnetic flows, or natural harmonics in a way later ages forgot. Scientists would urge caution, and rightly so. Much of this language is modern projection draped over old sites. Yet even stripped of exaggerated claims, there remains something real underneath. Ancient builders frequently chose powerful places, heights, horizon points, springs, fault lines, caves with unusual acoustics, places where the body feels the land before the mind explains it. That selection itself can look like hidden science when viewed from far enough away. You know that feeling when a place seems charged, and you are embarrassed by the word charged, yet cannot think of a better one. Ancient people often built in such places. Mu believers interpret that as inheritance from a mother civilization of geomantic mastery. Skeptics interpret it as ordinary human sensitivity to dramatic landscapes. The source wisely lets those two thoughts share a bench in the dark. Then come the stones again, but in a different mood. Not as monuments now, but as problems. Blocks weighing many tons, moved over distances, fitted at angles, raised into forms that still irritate modern people who think the past was made of incompetence and mud. The source is good here because it does not insult ancient labor by pretending every large stone requires secret anti-gravity. It honors the real mystery instead. Human coordination at scale is already astonishing. Add inherited geometry, ritual motivation, elite planning, and centuries of repetition, and the stones do not become less magical. They become more humanly wonderful. Still, Mu believers hear something else. A memory of better methods. Lost transport knowledge. Sound. Balance. Harmonic principles. Precise measuring systems descended from a parent culture older than all known states. The AI side of this retelling adds an interesting layer. Engineers and archaeologists have fed construction models from multiple ancient sites into simulation systems, testing labor requirements, transport methods, ramp angles, friction coefficients, and acoustic properties of chambers. The results often show that mainstream methods are more plausible than popular mysticism suggests. But they also reveal something humbling. Ancient builders regularly operated at the far edge of what large, organized human communities can achieve without modern machines. That means the awe is deserved, even when the fantasy is not. And awe, once earned, becomes fertile ground for Mu. The source then returns to the Nakul as carriers of this integrated knowledge. Not just migrants now, but teachers. They survive catastrophe. They reach other shores. They bring calendars, star lore, monument planning, sacred symbols, and principles of social order. Over generations, their memory becomes myth. Gods, giant, feathered serpents, shining strangers, bearded priests, sea sages, ancestral founders. The exact costume changes from culture to culture. The narrative function remains. Civilization arrives from beyond the immediate local horizon. There is a sadness in that too. If true, or even half true in symbolic form, then the world's greatest achievements after Mu would always feel slightly second-hand. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, the Pacific Islands, all as heirs to a shattered source. They can continue but not fully restore. The source does not force that idea, but it lets it breathe, and it becomes one of the most emotionally persuasive parts of the whole legend. By now, the listener should feel why Mu refuses to die. It is not merely because people enjoy pseudo-history. It is because Mu offers a shape in which beauty, catastrophe, migration, memory, knowledge, and longing all fit together. The lost stones the shared symbols, the teachers from the sea, the ancient science of sound and sky. It tells us that civilization did not crawl upward in isolation, but broke apart from something already whole. Whether or not that is true in literal history, it is a very powerful thing to want. And that is why the next movement matters so much. Because after all this beauty and symbolic richness, the source must finally walk straight into the hard, white light of geology and archaeology. It must ask what science allows, what the seafloor actually says, and whether Mu survives better as a drowned continent or as something more subtle, a mosaic of many real losses remembered as one. By this point in the story, Mu has already passed through almost every shape the human mind can give to a lost world. It has been a continent, a motherland, a cartographic temptation, a spiritual ancestor, a library without shelves, a rumor in ruins, and a dream poured into stone. Now the source does something I admire very much. It takes the dream by the shoulders and turns it toward the hardest light in the room. Science. Not the cartoon version of science that only says no and slams every old door shut. The slower version. The one that maps, measures, samples, compares, and waits. The one that does not care whether a story is romantic. The one that sends pulses into dark water and reads the returning signals like a second kind of scripture. This is where the legend of Mu is either supposed to die or, more interestingly, change form. The source begins with the Pacific floor itself, and that is exactly right. If Mu was a true continent in the grand Churchward sense, larger than many modern landmasses, rich in cities and plains and mountain chains later reduced to islands, then the ocean should remember it materially. The earth is not sentimental, but it is a good archivist. Continents leave certain signatures. Continental crust is different from oceanic crust. It is thicker, lighter, older in a particular way. It carries different mineral stories. It resists certain forms of disappearance. You can drown coasts. You can submerge shelves. You can split and move plates over immense time. But you do not simply hide an entire recent continent under the Pacific and leave no recognizable continental body behind. That is where the source's first great disillusionment arrives. Modern plate tectonics does not support a lost Mu. Not as Churchward described it. The Pacific Basin, for all its vastness and mystery, is not a place where a human age continent conveniently sank beneath the waves and politely disappeared. Much of the crust there is oceanic, basaltic, volcanic, created and recycled through deep geologic processes utterly unlike the behavior of continental masses. There are plateaus, seamounts, ridges, trenches, and volcanic provinces of astonishing size. Yes, but these are not the drowned remains of a vanished human cradle in the literal sense Mu believers often want. The source lets that land heavily, and it should. A sleep story can be gentle while still allowing the truth to feel cold when it needs to. Recently, teams using advanced AI-assisted geological modeling took high-resolution bathymetric grids, crustal thickness estimates, seismic profiles, and plate reconstructions from across the Pacific and ran comparative simulations against the kind of landmass Churchward proposed. The outcome was devastating for a literal Mu continent. The models could not produce a plausible scenario in which such a continent existed in the late human past, supported a civilization of the type imagined, then disappeared in one catastrophic sinking without leaving unmistakable continental evidence. The Pacific can lose coastlines, eastlands, volcanic arcs, and low lands. It does not quietly hide a missing civilization-sized continent of that kind. That should be the end, at least in the simplistic version of the story. But the source refuses to stop there, and that is exactly why it remains interesting. Because once the literal continent begins to collapse under science, another possibility rises from underneath it. Calmer, sadder, and in many ways more believable. What if Mu was never one land? What if it was many losses remembered as one? That single shift changes the whole emotional climate. Instead of asking the Pacific to conceal a geological impossibility, the source asks memory to do something. Memory does very well. Compression, fusion, symbolic gathering. Human beings do not preserve the past like laboratory freezers. We preserve it like storytellers. We merge storms. We condense migration. We wrap several generations of fear into one flood. We take many shattered shores and teach children one name for all of them. And suddenly, Mu starts feeling different. Not false. Composite. This is where the story moves toward real, drowned worlds. And once it does, the room gets quieter. Doggerland is one of the clearest examples. That broad plain once linked Britain to mainland Europe. It held rivers, forests, animals, hunting grounds, human movement, and ordinary life. Then sea levels rose. Storm surges came. The world narrowed. What had once been land became seabed. The memory of such a place, had it not been lost to historical silence in so many ways, would almost certainly have taken on mythic contours. A broad homeland, taken by water, preserved only in fragments. Sunderland offers another powerful case. During lower sea levels, much of what is now maritime Southeast Asia formed an immense connected region of plains, rivers, and habitable territory. When the ice melted and the waters rose, coastlines redrew themselves on a civilizational scale. Human populations moved. Memories must have moved too. Songs, warnings, sacred geographies, stories about where the sea used to be. All of that would have entered culture even when the precise maps were gone. The source uses these examples with admirable restraint. It does not say Doggerland was Mu. It does not say Sunderland was Mu. It says something more delicate. Real drowned lands prove that humanity has lived through the loss of large inhabited spaces before. Not once, but many times. That matters because it gives flood myths and lost homeland traditions a material environment in which to breathe. You know that feeling when a story becomes more believable at the exact moment it becomes less spectacular. That is what happens here. A giant Pacific continent sinking overnight is difficult to defend. Many drowned shelves, eastlands, deltas, coastlines, and migration corridors gradually fusing in oral memory into one old mother world that feels almost inevitable. The AI work described in the source adaptation becomes especially compelling at this stage. Researchers compared flood narratives, migration motif, and homeland loss traditions against paleoclimate timelines, sea level curves, tsunami records, and known submerged landscapes. Not every tradition matched neatly. That would be suspicious if it did. But enough overlap appeared in key structural zones that a broad picture emerged. Human cultures remember the sea with surprising depth. They preserve the fact of loss long after they lose the geography. They do not always preserve scale accurately. They preserve trauma, pattern, direction, and emotional truth. That is a very different kind of evidence from a temple rising out of the seafloor. But it may be closer to how old memory actually works. The source then softens the argument into what it effectively calls a mosaic theory. Mu may not be one drowned continent. It may be a grand narrative vessel holding many real drowned worlds. A memory composite. A motherland not because one single place birthed all civilization, but because many coastal peoples lost homes to water and later storytellers, occultists, explorers, and speculative historians braided those losses together until they behaved like one ancestral wound. I find that idea deeply moving, because it preserves the emotional power of Mu without requiring bad geology. It lets the ocean keep some of its grief without forcing it to keep a continent it never had. And once you begin to see Mu that way, many of the stories gathered earlier take on a new softness. Polynesian lost lands, Kumari Kandam, Atlantis, flood survivors carrying knowledge, coastal spirits, culture bringers arriving by sea. None of these need to be literal entries in one drowned atlas. They can be regional memories of rupture, later caught in the same gravitational field of meaning. Mu becomes the name modern imagination gives to a family of ancient losses. The source is especially elegant when it returns to the Pacific after this realization. The black water has changed again. It is no longer an empty hiding place for a missing supercontinent. It is a layered archive of local drownings, volcanic violence, migration, roots, navigational brilliance, and islands that remember a larger world in smaller forms. The ocean does not need to hide one giant continent to be full of swallowed human history. That may be enough to unsettle any careful listener. Because then the question is no longer, did Mu exist exactly as Churchward said? The better question becomes, how much human prehistory is underwater, fragmented, and emotionally preserved only through stories we have been too proud to hear properly? If you were standing now in a dark research room, with seafloor scans glowing blue-white on a monitor, you would see trenches, ridges, canyons, drowned channels, and plateaus. Most of them are perfectly explicable within known geology. Yet, some of the channels were once rivers. Some of the submerged plains were once coast. Some of the terraces were once lived near, walked past, named. The science removes one fantasy and reveals 100 smaller realities that are in some ways more haunting than the fantasy ever was. That is where the source leaves us at the end of this movement. Not with a grand yes or a mocking no, with a transformed Mu, a mosaic, a memory engine, a drowned synthesis built from many true losses and many later acts of imaginative stitching. The continent may be gone because it never existed. The grief that gave rise to it may still be entirely real. And once that settles, the final movement has only one place left to go. If Mu survives best as memory rather than geology, then what exactly has survived? Not land, not cities, not a verified archive. So what remains? Songs, symbols, navigation, ritual, architecture, flood warnings, the emotional outline of a cradle that may never have been one place, yet still feels like origin. That is where the story ends, not under the sea, but inside human culture itself, where drowned worlds persist longest. By the last movement of the story, Mu has become less like a missing continent and more like a pressure inside human memory. That may sound vague at first, but I think it is actually the most precise thing the source finally offers. Once geology has narrowed the possibilities, once the literal Pacific mother continent can no longer stand without wobbling, what remains is not nothing. What remains is the remarkable fact that cultures across time keep generating the same emotional architecture. A world before, water rising, knowledge scattered, survivors carrying fragments, sacred skills inherited from elsewhere, the sea as destroyer, road, witness, and vault. If Mu survives anywhere, it survives there. The source gathers these remnants patiently, not as proof in the courtroom sense, more like the last objects left in a house after the walls have gone. Navigation is one of them. The Pacific world alone should keep us humble for a very long time. Long before modern instruments, navigators crossed vast open waters by reading swell patterns, birds, cloud forms, stars, reflected lagoon light, wind texture, and seasonal motion. That is real. It is documented. It is sophisticated enough to make most industrial people feel clumsy by comparison. For believers, such knowledge becomes a surviving strand from Mu. For mainstream historians, it belongs to the genius of Austronesian and Polynesian traditions. The source does not force a false choice. It simply asks us to notice how easily great skill becomes mythologized when later generations no longer understand it from the inside. I have always thought that is one of the great engines of legend. Mastery, once broken in transmission, begins to look supernatural. The same can be said of agriculture and landscape shaping. Terraced hillsides, irrigation channels, sacred platforms, water management systems, maritime adaptation. The source suggests that what later imagination may call memory of Mu could just as well be the half-preserved inheritance of many ancient coastal and island societies that knew how to live with sea, tide, and fragile land in ways modern people are only beginning to rediscover. If that is true, then Mu is not a lie. It is a mistaken concentration of distributed brilliance. Then there is architecture. This is where the source becomes very gentle and very sad. Monumental forms continue to recur across the world. Pyramids, Terraces, aligned ceremonial spaces, giant statuary, horizon observatories, places where stone holds both political and cosmic meaning at once. Earlier in the story, the temptation was to treat these as fingerprints of a drowned parent civilization. Now the tone shifts. Perhaps they are not fingerprints at all. Perhaps they are echoes. Not signs that one continent taught everyone. Signs that many human worlds, facing sky, death, legitimacy, and the need for permanence, kept making structures that answer the same deep questions. And yet the myth of Mu still matters even in that softened reading, because it reminds us to take these convergences seriously, not lazily. Similarity does not prove common origin, but repeated similarity across sacred architecture, flood memory, solar ritual, and seaward identity does show that human civilization may have older, shared emotional roots than tidy textbooks prefer. The source also folds modern climate anxiety into the ending, and I think that is one of its most intelligent moves. We live again in an age of rising seas, drowning coasts, disappearing shorelines, and communities negotiating with water in ways that feel both contemporary and prehistoric. Islands face erosion. Delta cities grow vulnerable. Storm surges redraw maps. Entire populations begin using language of retreat, adaptation, loss, or managed withdrawal. In Zuck and H, Mu stops looking like an antique oddity. It starts looking like a myth we are preparing to understand much too well. You know that feeling when an old story suddenly stops being ancient and starts sounding like a message left for us by people who already knew the shape of what was coming. That is the effect here. Recently, AI-based coastal change models have been used to simulate how present-day populations may remember submerged homelands 1,000 years from now, if archives fail and only oral memory survives. The results are haunting. Precise coastlines disappear from cultural memory quickly. Emotional truths remain. The place where the dead once stood. The old fishing grounds. The vanished road. The hill that became an island. The city taken by one terrible season. Over generations, separate flood events merge. Distance blur. Dates collapse. One drowned place begins standing in for many. In other words, modern science now shows exactly how a Mu-like memory could form without requiring a single literal Mu. That may be the strongest insight in the entire source. Mu survives because it behaves the way memory behaves under catastrophe. It takes many losses and makes one story large enough to carry them. It gives water a face. It gives scattered survivors a common ancestor. It gives fragments a motherland. And fragments are everywhere. A song teaching the order of stars over open sea. A ritual platform raised where flood once reached. A serpent carved in stone as if movement itself were sacred. A myth of a teacher who arrived by boat after disaster. A story of a city that sank in one night. A legend of lands to the south or west, now gone. A navigation pattern preserved after its original shoreline vanished. A sacred calendar still counting from an older seasonal world. The source does not say, all these fragments prove Mu. It says something more nuanced and more durable. They prove that human culture is full of surviving pieces from drowned contexts. Mu is the imaginative name we sometimes give to the totality of those pieces when we no longer know how they once fit together. That is why the title can still hold. What if Mu was the forgotten cradle of all civilizations? If taken literally, the answer is probably no. Not in the continental sense the grandest believers want. The geology does not carry that weight. The archaeology does not deliver the cities. The missing tablets remain missing. But if the question is softened just enough, it becomes strangely powerful. What if Mu names a forgotten cradle not because one giant Pacific land birthed everyone, but because many early human worlds near coasts, shelves, eastlands, and drowned plains contributed more to civilization than surviving dry land history can easily reconstruct? What if the sea has taken far more first chapters than we are comfortable admitting? That possibility lingers. The source ends by returning us to the Pacific, and I think that is perfect. Night again, wind again, black water again. But the ocean has changed since the beginning. At first, it was blank enough to receive fantasy. Now it feels inhabited by absence. Not one absence. Thousands. Drowned valleys. Flooded plains. Canoe routes remembered in chant. Reefs that once edged broader land. Islands that may hold stories older than their current coastlines. The water is no longer empty. It is layered with lives that left less than stone. I find that more beautiful than the old grand continent in some ways. A literal Mu would have been a marvel. Yes. But a world in which countless early communities lost land to rising seas, carried memory forward in song, symbol, and ritual, and later gave rise to one vast composite myth of the motherland. That feels heartbreakingly human. And perhaps that is the final gift of the legend. It teaches humility. History on land is only the part the sea permitted us to keep. Archaeology begins where water stopped winning. Civilization may have more shoreline in its ancestry than the surviving record can show. Myth is not always error. Sometimes it is damage, carrying truth in symbolic form. By the time the fire beside us has burned low, Mu no longer needs to be either fully real or fully false. It becomes something more interesting. A vessel for ancient grief. A map of memory where coastlines blur but loss remains sharp. A reminder that the first teachers may not have come from one continent, but from many drowned worlds. A caution that we too are building future myths right now. In cities, beside unstable water, under skies that feel more historical every year. If future generations inherit only fragments of us, a flooded avenue, a ritual object, a half-remembered warning, a song about where the shoreline used to be, they may build their own Mu from our remains. They may imagine one lost mother city where there were many. They may compress our maps into one sacred name. They may kneel over our drowned foundations with the same mixture of longing and uncertainty we bring to the Pacific tonight. And so the story closes where it began, over dark water, with the horizon refusing to explain itself. Somewhere beneath the waves, there are certainly no roads from Churchward's empire waiting to be brushed clean tomorrow. But there are drowned lands. There are erased coasts. There are human beginnings the sea has thinned into silence. There are songs still carrying old shorelines in disguised form. There are monuments that keep asking larger questions than their own cultures can fully contain. There is the stubborn human instinct to gather scattered grief into one lost cradle and give it a name. Mu may not have been a continent, but as memory, it may still be one of the truest things we have ever invented about the sea. Good night,